So my name's Bianca Crespo. I'm a producer at Santa Mira Studio, and thank you for joining me for Cold Red. I am joined by Ray Carr, who has worked on an incredible case that spanned over a 30-year manhunt for one of the most notorious bank robbers in history in Pennsylvania. I'm also joined by Fitzgerald, James R. Fitzgerald, who worked on the incredible Unabomber case. He's responsible for also working tirelessly to catch that man, and he worked on the John Benet Ramsey case and numerous cases across the entire country. And I think it's wonderful that we're discussing certain crimes today, and I look forward to joining us for this intense conversation. It's wonderful to essentially have that kind of commentary, dependent on who is watching these news outlets, and gaining that kind of insight and information from someone who's very experienced and with a background such as yourself. I think it's very important to have. And that also brings me to, Ray, you have been making the media rounds as well regarding the case in Massachusetts, with the real estate executive, I believe, correct?
Yeah, it's funny, but I have to thank Jim for that. Jim is not an early riser, and at Fox and Friends in the morning, they wanted me to come on at 5:30, 20 of six in the morning. Or no, I'm sorry, it was more like 20 of seven in the morning, 6:40. And so I did, and we talked about some of the things that were going on in that case at the time. And I remember Steve Ducey saying to me, uh, "What do you think about the $450 that he spent at Home Depot on cleaning supplies?" And I kind of said to him, I said, "Well, Steve, when's the last time you spent $450 on cleaning supplies?" And he said, "Never." And I said, "You're right." So he asked me what my outlook was for it, and I says, "I anticipate that Brian Walsh is going to be arrested very shortly and charged with the murder of Anna Walsh." And a week later, Brian Walsh was arrested and charged. So that seemed to come through, and I haven't spoke to anybody since then about that. But I think the things that are going on now with that case is that there's discovery, and it's mostly a circumstantial case because of the fact that there's Anna Walsh has never been found, and the prosecutor believes that she was dismembered and put in plastic bags and put in a dumpster that was eventually incinerated. So, but there is at times some great success with prosecutions where the victim is never found, and there is a lot of success with those. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that is seated here, and there's quite a bit of that in this case, which I don't think is going to bode well for Mr. Walsh.
Absolutely. I feel like there has been a lot of interesting cases recently regarding this kind of behavior where you have this picture perfect, seemingly picture perfect couple, family, what have you. They seem to have it all. And then this kind of incident happens. And it's similar to the Dr. Jeffrey McDonald case, the Murdaugh murders, where you have these people who are very in positions of power, I would say, in some aspect, and they have a certain lifestyle that seems very Stepford wifeish in that sense, where it's nice, but that's the outside perception. And then when these things occur, it seems like there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. So I would love to know regarding your experience with, let's say, these particular cases. You can touch on either one, dependent on if you're comfortable speaking regarding that. But I feel like this kind of sociopathic behavior is very dominant in these kinds of cases. So I would love to know your thoughts regarding this kind of personality.
Well, let me start with following up, Bianca, on something you just said, and that is, as a relatively young police officer, I was drafted to work in the detective division at Bensalem PD. I was only a cop for about a year and a half, and there was a homicide case that we were working, and then, of course, I became a detective. I was promoted and worked more. And what I found out is still water runs deep. And not so much young kids or something like that. Maybe even teenagers, they're pretty much out there and they do what they do. But for married couples and men and women, if they're homicide victims, there's a lot we can find out about them through an investigation. And in these early days with me, the 70s, the 80s, and even early cases in the FBI, it's well before social media. So this type of information would come about maybe through some basic phone records. And even those weren't that involved back then. Ray, you can remember sometimes all you get was the phone numbers. You'd do all kinds of searches on who they belong to, and then you find out who's having interactions with whom, and take it from there. And sometimes phone calls are made from a phone booth. Well, gee, why? Or received from a phone booth. Why would that happen? And invariably there'd be maybe some hint or suggestion of an affair or some illicit spending of money for whatever reason. And sometimes, as it turns out, it had nothing to do with the homicide. The homicide occurred for completely different reasons. So it is interesting, and when you break down someone's life, there could be questions that we all have about them, about these individual people, especially homicide victims, homicide suspects, and what those clues are found to be may play a direct role in the commission of the crime, maybe an indirect role, sometimes nothing at all to do with it. So it's interesting how all that plays out. So I'm not saying everyone has skeletons in their closet, because they don't, but they may have little tiny bone chips that if someone's going to deep dive into their personal life through now social media, phone records, things like that, it could raise some questions in terms of where do the investigators go next, and where do they focus in that regard. So yeah, there's a lot of psychopathy going on in some of these cases we talked about, and by the way, my policy has been for years doing media interviews. I don't verbalize the names of mass killers or serial killers, and I'm going to stick with that in cold red here. If others want to say it, that's fine. Individual killers like Murdaugh and people like that, we can reference. Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy, or at least he was part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. I certainly have no problems with names like that. But there are some other people, including a case we're going to talk about a little bit later, just happened today in Nashville. I prefer not to give those people any sort of legitimacy by using their names, whether they changed their names recently, first name, last name, whatever. They have nicknames. So that's going to be me and my particular policy in that regard on this show. Even Megyn Kelly asked me about my policy back in January when she interviewed me, and she said, "That's not."
No, I think it's perfect for what we are trying to do with this podcast. We've spoken previously with our pilot episode regarding this nature, this policy that you have, and I think it's a good one in the sense that we are about the victims, and we're about educating and enlightening people to prevent this kind of crime from occurring, or preventing future victims. So I think it's very important that we stick to that and not give so-and-so any more celebrity or any kind of notoriety, anything, because they don't deserve it. And I mean, anyone who should be in the light should be these poor people who suffered at the hands of these personalities. And that being said, let me dive a little bit deeper in terms of a case that I touched upon regarding Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, who was at Fort Bragg, and I believe you're familiar with this case. 1970, he brutally murdered his wife and his two daughters. And again, this is a known case, so I just say the name just for the sake of it being a known case. But I would love to get your analysis regarding what led to something so horrible, and what you two think is very important in that kind of case, moving forward with what we're going to talk about later on.
Let me start out with this, and you've mentioned 4 cases here: the Idaho murders, the Anna Walsh homicide, the Murdaugh murders, and the Jeffrey McDonald murder. And the one common thread here in all 4 of these is the fact that each of these offenders thought they were smarter than law enforcement. They thought that they could outthink law enforcement as in the Anna Walsh case, as in the Idaho murders. Shutting off your phone so they couldn't determine your location and then turning it back on when you get out of the area. And then you look at McDonald, who was a medical doctor who thought, I'm a smart guy. I went to Princeton. I'm a bright guy. And then you look at Murdaugh, who was, his family was a mainstay in the southern part of South Carolina for 100 years. He could kind of do what he wanted to do. He had everybody, supposedly he thought, in his back pocket. And then all of a sudden that kind of changed a little bit. But the one thing that is different between the McDonald murders and the Murdaugh murders is that I see, and Jim, you can comment to this, is there was overkill in the McDonald murders. Whereas, and what I mean by that is that the number of stab wounds that each of the victims, his two children and his wife, was astronomical. There were 30 or 40 stab wounds in each victim and bludgeoning of that. Where in the Murdaugh case, he shot his wife and shot his son with a shotgun. And it was over that quick. So it was almost like for Murdaugh, it was business. McDonald was trying to set a point, and he used the Manson murders as a kind of a stepping stone for himself with that. But I get that's kind of where I look at that, and it kind of where it starts for me when you're trying to look at these type of offenders and what they're doing. And you said this earlier, Bianca, and so did Jim, is that we always get so caught up in the offender's behavior that we lose sight of the victim. And I know that's something on Cold Red here that we really want to kind of gravitate towards is, hey, let's not forget about the victims here. And when you look at Anna Walsh and you look at Brian Walsh, you have two parents that are gone. One's in prison and one is dead, and they have three children. And nobody thinks about them. Nobody talks about them. They're an afterthought. You look at Idaho and you look at the four victims that were killed there, but nobody thinks about their families and the wound that will never be healed, So you look at that, you look at McDonald, and you look at the parents, and most of the people in that case, in the McDonald case, are now dead. The prosecutor, the judge, the in-laws, most of those people are gone. And in the Murdaugh case, I don't think that's over yet. There's several homicides that are tied to that family. The boating accident, which was his son, Paul, who was killed. Then you have the young man who was found in the road. And then you have the housekeeper who fell down a flight of steps. Correct. So, I mean, there's some questions that are still going on here, but I think there's a lot to be said, but we can't lose sight of the victim.
Not at all. And I think it's important, as we spoke about previously, and that being said, with these cases, is there something we need to know about regarding these victims in particular for these cases? Is there anything that kind of would educate others in regards to certain behaviors that would help those who listen to this podcast in terms of moving forward with their own lives and being careful?
Well, we profilers came up with a term a long time ago, and that is victimology. It's very important to us as we are, in fact, investigating a crime or series of crimes to know everything we can about the victim. I referenced this a little bit earlier, even in my early days as a police officer with phone records and neighborhood interviews, things like that. But certainly we want to know all that we can about the victims and what caused them to become a target of a violent offender. Obviously, if it's a domestic situation like Murdaugh and a wife and a child, there may be a whole lot of behavioral history behind them. But when it's sort of a stranger homicide or not someone directly linked to the victim or the family, which about 80% of homicides are, they're committed by someone known to the victim, this changes the paradigm a bit. So that's why we want to know everything we can about the victim of these types of crimes, and then do our best, and we'll try to do this on Cold Red, but to do our best to talk to people, men, women, younger people, boys, girls, let them know in fact, there are ways to avoid becoming a crime victim, a crime statistic, and no one's 100% safe all the time, but you can certainly lessen the odds of becoming victimized yourself, either from car theft or carjacking, or certainly much worse than that, sexual assault, to include upwards towards the area, even homicide. So these are all types of things we're hoping to get across on this particular show this evening, and as we go along with Code Red. But going back to Jeffrey McDonald and Murdaugh, and Ray brought up a few common factors there, perhaps between them. The first thing that struck me, I read Fatal Vision years ago. Joe McGinnis, I think, was the author of that, and there was a TV movie made about it, and I'm certainly familiar with the Murdaugh case. But both of these two men, both of these now convicted killers, the one thing they have in common is great hubris. They feel they can talk and get away with anything they want, and they think they're smarter than the average bear. Certainly do include the police, as Ray said earlier, and that's what in fact tripped them up in the long run. Jeffrey McDonald was going out doing TV talk shows, referencing the homicides of his wife and his two children, and it was his father-in-law, in fact, that's watching him on Merv Griffin or some of these other shows back in the 70s and early 80s. Says, wait a minute, he didn't tell me that, the week of the murder. Wait a minute, he said something else 3 months later, and it was finally the father-in-law who went to, I believe, was the state police or the Army investigators, I should say, and put this whole case together. So good for the father-in-law sticking with it, and and I see even Murdaugh, he took the stand in his own defense at his double homicide trial. Not everyone does that either, but he was a lawyer. He cross-examined many people over the days, over his career. He had supposedly he was known for his closing arguments when he was defending someone. So he thought he could give a great closing argument while testifying, which of course everyone knows. We're protected from self-incrimination in this country under the U.S. Constitution. We don't have to testify against ourselves, provide evidence against ourselves in any sort of a criminal type of procedure. But he said, I'm going to go and do it. I can get my story across to these jury members. But what was it, like an hour, maybe 90 minutes at most, that the jury came back and said, sorry, you're convicted, both counts of homicide. So again, the hubris on this guy's part just caught up with him eventually, and now he's exactly where he should be in prison, and he's going to wind up dying there too, just like Jeffrey McDonald.
Let me swing back, Bianca, a minute, what Jim said when he talks about victimology. And you say, how can people prevent themselves from becoming the victim of a crime? Well, one of the things that and Jim knows this too, one of the things we talk about is a thing called target hardening. And what we say is that how can we help better prepare ourselves not to be the victim of a crime? In other words, a lot of times people are specifically selected, and sometimes there's nothing you can do. You're going to be a victim no matter what. But there's so many things that you can do. For instance, locking your car at night that's in your driveway. Coming out of the mall and walking the parking lot, being aware of your surroundings, your situational awareness. You have a home, and you have a beautiful home. And because it costs so much for the mortgage, I don't want to turn the outside lights on, because if I do, I turn those outside lights on, it's going to make my electric bill go up. But what you're doing is you're creating an atmosphere that is going to make it an easier target for someone to burglarize or to make entry into your home. Bushes up around your home, things of that nature. There's so many things that you can do. Like, for instance, why go to a movie at 11 o'clock that brings you out at 1 o'clock in the morning? A lot of times what people become victims of crime is because there's a lack of guardianship. There's not enough people around. That's why it's always saying, hey, if a cop pulls you over, make sure you pull into a well-lit area, well-populated area, because then something bad is less likely to happen to you. So just a couple little things like that, and we'll talk more about that as we continue through this.
You bring up a good point, though, regarding that idea of being less likely labeled as prey to these predators, and putting yourself in these situations where something bad could happen. And I feel like going back to what you said, Fitz, regarding the personality of this kind of like overcompensation, talking the big talk, that predator kind of aspect, that alpha kind of male, where I'm smarter than you, I'm the best. I'm curious in terms of that, and examining that kind of person. Have you two had cases that you've worked on previously that are specific in that nature, where you have this male, this character who is very much, oh, I planned everything out to a T. I was meticulous. They'll never catch me. Do you find that there are many cases like this? Does that like represent essentially a lot of your history working with different cases, or would you say that it's a small percentage?
Most serial offenders, Bianca, think that way. Now, if they're drug-addled, if they're junkies, that changes the paradigm. They're going to, you can almost predict when they're going to rob the bank next based on how much heroin they need to shoot in their arms and what the street cost is for that day. But what's sort of an irony to my particular training as a profiler in terms of what we're talking about here, we were sent out to the prisons in Virginia to interview sexual assault offenders who basically were in there for life. They weren't doing anything to get out. I mean, they were there for life. And I remember talking to one of them saying not only did he enjoy raping women, but he remembers watching TV one night, some sort of a Crime Stopper show. There was some police officer, local officer, talking to a crowd somewhere, saying, well, women, here's what you got to do. And a lot of things that Ray already said, all common sense things, which of course I agree with. But they also said, well, women, take some self-defense courses and learn how to protect yourself and defensive tactics to get away from someone and parry a blow and all these type things if someone's trying to strike you. Well, this guy heard this serial rapist, and he would sit outside a karate studio when it was women's night, and he would watch them through the plate glass window in their white, outfits and, with their various colored belts, and they would be practicing defending themselves. And on at least two occasions, he followed these women away from that structure, that strip mall, and he somehow managed to pull them over or confront them somewhere far away, and he sexually assaulted them. He even went after a female police officer once, the same guy, because she represented arrest power. She carried a gun. He actually somehow found out. He followed her home from work, then followed her doing something else a day or two later when she was off duty, and wound up not only assaulting her, but taking her gun from her. And luckily, these people lived, but and eventually, of course, the evidence came about that he was arrested and convicted. But we're looking here at individuals like these. We can be alpha males or alpha females. That's okay. There's a societally permissible way to fit into those personas and in fact be successful in whatever chosen field you're in. But sometimes that can bleed over into the area of psychopathy, and we have someone who would in fact be a psychopath. And the guy I just described, who sat outside the karate facilities, he definitely fit the category of psychopath. He had some other psychological issues too. And these are the people that, of course, can be very dangerous. These are the people that have no emotional feelings for others. They could care less about others. They're narcissistic. They don't care what you say or do. It's all about what they want at that given time. So they're the ones that are, of course, more difficult to understand their motivations, because it may not be greed, it may not be money, it may not even be sex per se. It's more about power and control and negating the very existence of someone if they're going to kill them. So these are the kind of people that, we in the law enforcement community, we as profilers, we as FBI agents and detectives at the local level, these are the kind of people that we go up against. And we're the kind of people, they do think they're smarter than us, but even Ted Kaczynski, as high as his IQ was, aka the Unabomber, of course. He was eventually brought down. You could say, too, by his own hubris when he started writing to the New York Times, his paper of record, and giving us enough clues linguistically that he had never given before on his bombs or anything else that wound up leading to his identification and arrest. Yeah, criminals commit crimes for different reasons, and but sometimes there are these core behavioral elements about them that, given the right time, the right breaks, and the right experience on the part of the investigators, they can be identified, arrested, and convicted.
Bianca, I've never heard an offender say, you know, I can't wait to commit this crime so I can get caught. The whole purpose of committing a crime is making sure that you don't get caught. Otherwise, there's no sense in committing it. They're all looking for a way to do that. And what we identify that is their modus operandi and their MO, which people call their MO, and how they do it. And they continue to perfect their method and means of how they do things based upon their experience, based upon their educational level of doing it over and over again, looking to do it the best way they can so they don't get caught.
It's fascinating to me regarding that, what you both brought up so excellently in terms of this power and control, and how it also brings about this, this mischievous nature of, not wanting to get caught. They won't catch me. Like, there's some sort of lure to that as well. And that would bring me to, of course, this horrendous news that has been breaking today, with the shooting in Nashville, Tennessee. And it happened at an elementary school. I don't want to speculate. I'm just looking over the facts here to make sure everything is correct. And I know we had discussed, like you brought up, Fitz, this issue with celebrity and saying the name and everything. And I have a question for you too regarding this kind of celebrity nature. Do you believe that these shootings that keep happening is partially due to this want to become this kind of celebrity? Do you think there is a tiny portion of these events occurring because there is that kind of nature in whoever commits this kind of crime?
I think that's maybe one of the reasons, but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. People don't wake up in the morning and go, yeah, today is March 27th. I think today I'm going to become a mass murderer. People don't wake up and do that. There's a process they go through, a pathway, you might say, to violence. And it kind of, and usually for the offender, but usually on the back end is that they get help by the system, by the school. There's usually a breakdown in the security system somewhere that allowed this to happen. But we're not going to go in there because I don't know what that breakdown is. And I really don't know what this person's pathway, but there was a grievance that this individual had. And I don't know what that grievance is. We may never know what that grievance is because that person is no longer with us. But that grievance formulates into an ideation. Now they get an idea of what they want to do. And from an idea, they then get into the research and planning. And when they're in that research phase and they're in that planning phase, they're looking at past shootings and how were some of these other individuals successful in accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish. And they may use some of those things as a stepping stone or a learning piece, because many times these offenders only get one shot at this. Because you look and you think and you say, the average time for one of these things it lasts about 4 to 5 minutes. And the average response time to these incidences by law enforcement is 4 to 5 minutes. Now, that doesn't mean they engage, but today, from what I heard on news reports, within 14 minutes, law enforcement engaged the shooter and eliminated the threat. But once and that's, I think, for them to do that, the accolades, how many lives did they save? It's just amazing. But you look and you say, when you think about these individuals engaging in violence with a weapon, and how hard is it to pull a trigger and shoot somebody And how long does that take? And when you look at most instances that happen between a police officer and an offender, those things are over in 2.1 seconds, where somebody is down or somebody is shot or both people are shot. So imagine you're engaging someone that doesn't have a weapon, like little kids, teachers, and you cut that time in half. So imagine the number of people that could have been hurt more seriously or even killed had law enforcement not engaged them. But once they get through that, go back to the pathway, once they get through that research and planning, then they get into the preparation aspect where they'll purchase weapons, purchase ammunitions, maybe do some dry runs, things of that nature. Then they get to their point of no return, whatever that may be, and then it's the attack. But that all takes time. Like I said, it doesn't happen in a day. Looking at some of these things and having done my doctoral study on active shooters, a lot of these things, I think the quickest I've seen happen is about 2 weeks, and that was the one out in Arizona at the pathway where Congresswoman Gabby Gifford was shot. So when you look at that, that's how things kind of manifest with these individuals. But I agree with Jim. We should never glorify these or allow these people to give them that infamy that they may be seeking. But I don't know what this person's issue was. I know, based from the information that was received, that she was a former student. But that was many, many years ago. So I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe when they look into the computer and they look into her emails and her phone messages and other things, they may be able to find things. And the other thing that, and I know it's already been brought out, but she was a transgender and, transitioning into a man. It's very, very rare to see a female engaged in this type of behavior. It happens, but it's a lot rarer than a white male.
It is. That's what I believe was the most shocking for me, because it is typically a male. And the fact that it was a 28-year-old female who committed this horrific crime on children is hard to wrap my head around. And yes, of course it does as well.
So there's a few things here. I believe the police, the investigators will have some advantage in that. My understanding is this person had a manifesto of some sort, just like the former LA cop, I don't say his name either, back in 2013, he had a manifesto. The serial bomber in Austin, Texas in 2018, he had a manifesto. That was never released. I did read some of the former police officers' writings back at the time. Of course, the Unabomber had his manifesto. So this shooter from today in Nashville will have that manifesto. I'm not sure if it's online, if it's public, or if that's something that's handwritten, whatever, that only the police will have access to. But there will be a wealth of information in there. And they will, the investigators will also do, besides that, or in conjunction with that, a psychological autopsy. And of course, there'll be a physical autopsy of the body. They're going to determine manner of death, cause of death, what was the blood tox in there. And going through transitions such as this, what kind of chemicals was she on? Was she on testosterone? And was the level appropriate to her body size and weight and all that? Could that have caused some things to happen? That certainly shouldn't have today. These are all issues to be discussed down the line. And no one here is making any political statements about this at all. We're looking at this strictly from a violent crime perspective. This person had a homicidal ideation, probably a suicidal ideation. I can't imagine the person, they really thought they were going to survive this action today. They apparently had no body armor on, so and only so much ammunition, 2 long rifles and a handgun. So, but I do want to just follow up with what Ray said. The officers in Uvalde, Texas, back in June of last year, took a lot of heat, and I believe deservedly so, for not acting more proactively to end that situation. These Nashville officers, apparently they get the call, within minutes they're there, they're in engaging the shooter, over and done with. Unfortunately, 6 people dead. I'm not sure what the injury count is, but too many dead, and of course it could have been much worse. So hats off to these heroes. People love to abuse the cops, cut their budgets, defund them, and all these slogans that when protesters are out there throwing bottles at them. But when your school's being shut up, when your office is being shut up, it's not those protesters going to come and rescue you. It's going to be the police officer. And I think as you listen to Code Red, Ray and I have both been involved in the arrest of police officers, arrest of FBI agents. If they're dirty, if they're bad, we're going to say it. And that includes in the past, that includes present time. But on the whole, I think the law enforcement community in this country does an excellent job with the limited resources they have, and a lot of the negative reportage from today's media and other people on social media. So despite that, they're doing a heck of a job, and I hope the recruiting of good potential officers and agents keeps going on, and we keep getting quality folks to do the job for us there.
Bianca, let me add one more thing to what Jim was going there, is that a lot of times there's always a question is, how could this have been prevented? And it's the guns, and it's the problem with the guns. We need better gun laws. And you know what? To a point, I agree that we need to have stronger gun laws to make sure that the people that are buying these weapons are people that should have them. But here's the issue, is that there's always warning signs with this type of behavior. When we talked about that pathway to violence, in that there's time, because they have to plan, they have to research. And in that time, they're exuding with a thing we call leakage, where they leak behavior that other people notice but dismiss. So if people are wondering, how can law enforcement better help us solve this problem? Stop looking to law enforcement and start looking at yourself. How can you make this better? You want to make this better? It's not politicians. Government most of the time is the problem, not the solution. It's us as a people. The more aware we are of what's going around, the more aware that we see these things, and if we act on these things. People say, well, law enforcement doesn't do their job. Law enforcement can't be everywhere. Law enforcement can only act on information that they have. So if you give them information, they're going to react to it, and they're going to do a great job in doing it, just like you saw today. But give them the opportunity to do that job before something like this happens. That if you see behavior that you think is not quite right, then say something to somebody. Tell law enforcement. Let them know. And then you won't have to worry about that short window of 4 to 5 minutes, when this thing begins and ends, and law enforcement doesn't get there until most of the time it's over. Let law enforcement do their job, but you need to help them do it. We need to take control.
Absolutely. I think we need to work together, and I feel like it starts at taking accountability for actions. And if, like we talked about, situational awareness and making sure that you're prepared and you're aware. I think it's highly important, because everyone can point the finger. Anyone can point the finger. But looking at yourself, that's one thing, you need to take into account.
And as a follow-up to what Ray said, the media have to take some responsibility here too, as well as our elected officials. It seems within sometimes minutes of one of these shootings, politicians and D-listers, celebrities are out there tweeting away that it's strictly the NRA's fault, or it's strictly the Republicans' fault, or some other political party's fault, whatever, or some president's or governor's fault. No, the person who pulled the trigger, it's their fault. That's the one who should be blamed. That's the one who should be ostracized from the very beginning. If they want to say their names up front, that's fine. I choose not to say their names. But let's put it out there what total reprobates these people are to choose this sort of modality, this sort of action to address their grievances. And that's what this was. This person was, we're going to find out, a grievance collector of some sort. This person had felt victimized by many aspects of their life and going probably back to this school. They're going to trace back something in those school days. I think it was the principal. I'm not sure what her official title was. 60 years old, 60 years of age. I wonder if she was actually a teacher there when this shooter attended that school, and perhaps that was the primary target today. We're going to find out who was the primary target. Maybe the kids were, I hate to just use this term, but collateral damage to this person. But of course, they make their argument even better then. But also, besides the principal killing a janitor, and I think a substitute teacher probably just happened to be in the school that day, and of course, worst of all, I think they were all 9 years old, the kids. So the bad people in these shooting incidents, we can address political issues and gun control and all that. And of course, there's some way, including with Hollywood and what they depict in the movies, even the commercials for movies and the posters for movies that you see on Netflix or any other types of channels. And they just have to be a little more careful about that, maybe glorifying some of these weapons is not always the best thing. And the other part of it is, I always feel when I do media hits, and of course now we have our own podcast here, that criminals or future criminals are watching us or listening to us. And I always want to be very conscious and very cautious in, of course, what is said, what any of us would be saying on a certain program such as this. So if there's anyone out there that has this sort of ideation, please, temper it. Talk to loved ones. Talk to, family members. Talk to professional therapists. And let's try to get this matter handled. Shooting people, killing people is not the answer. I guarantee you, it's not going to solve your problems. And either you're going to be in jail for the rest of your life, you're going to wind up dead yourself. And there's so many other ways to address what issues are going on in your life that it doesn't have to be killing other innocent people.
Let's invite them on this show. You want someone to talk to? Let them come and talk to you, I, and Bianca.
Yeah.
Come and talk to us. We'll
air it out.
We'll listen. Air it out. Exactly right. You'll feel a lot better.
It'll be a Festivus. It'll be an airing of the grievances.
That's a Seinfeld issue. Festivus, right?
Yeah.
I picked that up, Bianca.
That's good. But no, but honestly, in sincerity, I firmly believe that there needs a lot of talking and less shooting. There needs to be some kind of discussion that needs to unfold before anything needs to come to such a horrific event. And that being said, I know we're running out of time here, but I would really love to end with a moment of silence. But before we even get to that, I would really like to thank you both for taking the time to really provide us with more insight into this crazy world that we live in, continue to live in, and at least enlightening anyone who's listening to this podcast and making them feel maybe not safer, but at least a little more aware and prepared for the next day and tomorrow. So I feel like right now, if you two don't have any last words, I would love to end with a moment of silence for the victims of the Murdaugh murders, as well as the McDonald murders, and finally the most recent shooting that occurred today at the, let me pronounce this correctly, the Covenant School, private Christian elementary school in Nashville, Tennessee. But do you two have any final words before we get to that? Yes, and the Idaho murders as well, and Massachusetts. Okay, so a moment of silence for all the victims of these crimes. Thank you too once again for joining me for another episode of Cold Red, and I really appreciate everything you've had to say on this very tragic day, I'd like to say. But again, because we're trying to do something to benefit all of our listeners, I feel like it's very important that we have these conversations and discussions, and perhaps even open it up to anyone who is struggling with any kind of demons or anything that they're battling, and hopefully prevent future crimes from happening. But until next time, this is Bianca Crespo, Fitz and Ray for Cold Red. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.